So many of you know that I've been a bit of a broken record on this subject, but I really think it is worth emphasizing because whenever you raise objections to how the DNC has orchestrated this debate qualification process, you get inundated with media scolds and others telling you that, oh, you're just sour because your favored candidate couldn't qualify per the long established rules. And while the rules in some way have been long established, they've never been rationalized, or the reasoning behind them has never been made public by the DNC. So that retort doesn't really hold up. Either way, it's worth drilling down into why these rules just don't make sense on a fundamental level, and don't take my word for it. Take what one of the most prominent pollsters in the country is now saying about how their and other poll results are being used to determine which candidates the American people can hear from on a debate stage. Marist College, which is one of the most preeminent pollsters in the country, one of the top ratings on 538, etc., has this podcast, just like everybody and their mother, right, now has a podcast, so they have one. And they devoted an entire episode to how polls are being misused by the Democratic Party, specifically the DNC. And they explain why using the criteria that they are really is a fundamental misreading of polling science. And so I want to play for you a clip from this podcast.
We've talked a lot about this. In fact, going back to 2016, the Marist poll took a bit of a stand on how polls, election polls, horse race polls, if you were being used. And there is a big hullabaloo right now about how the determination for who gets to stand on the next stage of the next Democratic debate is being determined by a series of polls, the big, well-run polls. But if you're at 2%, you're in. If you're at 1%, you're out. And the margin of error in these polls is well beyond 1%, which means what? Why is this such a bad idea?
Well, first of all, I think you hit the nail on the proverbial head on that, in that, the polls are not nearly as precise as the effort that's being applied to them, and certainly how they're being used. So if you're going to use polls as the Republicans did to rank candidates last time and say, all right, the top number of these guys make it, or if you're going to do it as the Democrats have, which has been, well, in this particular set of polls, the ABC one coming up, if you got 2% in 4 polls that they recognize, then you're in. And if you don't have 2%, you're not in. And the problem with that all is not only is the margin of error way beyond the precision that these polls are being used for, but not all polls are done equally. In fact, none of them are done exactly the same. And you certainly have polls that include undecided, and polls that include people who are leaning towards it, and polls that are including registered voters as opposed to likely voters, as opposed to whatever. You have state polls, you have national polls, and you have polls that are done on phone with live interviewers and other methods of collecting data. So you really have poll stew at this point, and yet they're sort of being equalized and said, okay, well, if you get 2%, you make it. Clearly, there are some folks who are making it and some are not making the cutoff. And I don't know if in statistics 1.4 is really different than 1.6, except that the 1.6 rounds up to 2 and the 1.4 doesn't. And one guy makes it, the other guy doesn't.
Okay, so you got that? That's a point that I've been screaming about now incessantly for a long time. And sure enough, it's being echoed by one of the very pollsters whose data is being misused in this fashion, especially with candidates who are on the lower tier of the polling end. You are having these decisive determinations made about the future of their campaigns based on what are essentially insignificant fractional differences, right? If a polling result is rounded up to 2%, that means it could be in the actual data 1.5 or 1.6%. And if it's rounded down, it could be, 1.4%. And there are some instances in which that could literally amount to like what is a in essence, a fraction of a person. And yet that makes all the difference in the world for whether candidates make the debate stage, which is, in an unfortunate way, a sort of do or die for their entire campaign. And so, again, don't take my word for it. Listen to what one of the most eminent pollsters in the country is actually saying about how the party apparatus is using their product. Marist College is a college in Poughkeepsie, New York. It's been doing a poll that has been well regarded for a long time. Not perfect, methodology perhaps open to scrutiny, but nonetheless, if they are sounding the alarm and saying, this is not what we wanted our polls to be used for, it's not a sound application of the statistical results. These differences that you're elevating as pivotal are actually not relevant, then, that could not more forcefully bolster the case that I've been trying to make about this process. And now in this next clip I'm going to play, they mention Tulsi by name as an example of a candidate who has been spuriously excluded. And they contrast her with Yang. The pollster happens to misstate his name as John Yang, which is kind of funny. But nonetheless, it really does sharpen the distinction here that it explains why this exclusion is so arbitrary. So let's hear it.
Isn't that the problem with all of these polls is that, a good survey goes out and gets between, 850 and 1,200 Americans. But then what you're really asking is how many Democrats support these? Well, so now you get Democrats. Maybe they're a third of the sample. And you're down to 300 or 400 at the top end of people that you're trying to make a determination whether somebody's at 1 or 2%. And if you happen to call 2 people who are for John Yang and 1 person who is for Tulsi Gabbard, and then the next poll flips it around to 2 and 1 the other way, those numbers change. And they're not inaccurate. It's simply, as you pointed out, you're trying to cut a diamond with a jackhammer. It doesn't work, and it shouldn't be. Polls should not be used this way.
There you have it. I don't know what to say on top of that. I mean, if it's coming from the belly of the beast there, so to say, then I don't know how better to explicate for people why this is a fairly egregious misuse of polls by the party apparatus to arbitrarily decide who gets to take part in these debates. It just doesn't hold up to logical scrutiny. You can get into the maybe deeper reasons why the military-industrial complex and their associates within the party structure may not like Tulsi, going back especially to 2016, when, of course, she resigned from the DNC to endorse Sanders. Those are more abstract questions. But in terms of the just hard data and statistical rationale, that alone, I think, should be sufficient to demonstrate why this process is so incredibly flawed. And Marianne Williamson, who has also been excluded, has weighed in numerous times and echoed Tulsi's sentiments. In fact, on Twitter last night, she explicitly said that she agreed with Tulsi, and she, I think, is with much justification pointing out that this amounts to sort of an elite gatekeeping function being performed by the DNC, citing rules as if they are kind of metaphysically unimpeachable and set in stone. No, these rules aren't constitutionally enshrined. They're devised by party bosses in secret and not subject to any real transparency. It's not like the Electoral College or something, which is in the Constitution, right? You can have criticisms of the Electoral College, fine, but rules set out by a party structure are in a fundamentally different category than other rules that are more constitutionally embedded that you may have objections to for one reason or another. So keep on pointing out the fallacies behind this exclusion. If you are a Tulsi supporter, I'm not quote unquote a supporter per se, but I've made I haven't shied away from saying that I think she would very much be a constructive force in the debates, and we'll see what happens. But hopefully more and more people are going to ascertain from this that the reasons for her exclusion just don't pass the smell test. All right. If you enjoy any of this content, once again, please consider a Patreon or PayPal donation. That information is in the description box, and have a nice day.